All right, welcome to East Coast, West Coast. I am Danny Rocco with my co-host Mike Flynn over there. You see him all the way on the right. And today we are taking note of the 45th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which signaled the end of the Vietnam War. So all of my Vietnam love bugs that are out there, you are going to love this. And there is no one person better to join us than Mr. Joe Galloway. How are you today, Joe?
I'm fine, thanks, Danny.
Well, if you don't know Joe, he is one of the most prominent correspondents of that war. You know, Joe spent, 10 years covering the war for the United Press International. Is that correct?
4 tours from beginning to end, about 3.5 years in
Okay.
in the war itself.
Cool. That is amazing. Just the fact that you came in not as a soldier, but you came in as a journalist.
That was my job then.
Okay, I have to ask because I've heard stories from Mike who popped out of here, but he will be back, and the stories that Mike's told me are crazy. Like, I'm so impressed. Did you volunteer for this, or is this like something that you were told that you had to go and do?
No, that first tour, I begged for 2 years to get there. I knew the war was coming. I knew that it was going to become America's war, and I I had to be there. Look,
Mm.
I was 23 years old when I arrived in Vietnam 3 weeks after the first battalion of U.S. Marines landed there in April of 1965. And I'd been working for 2 years to get UPI to send me there.
That you were a Spitfire.
I was absolutely young and ignorant. All I knew about combat was from watching John Wayne movies. And the thing about covering a war is that it's a very steep learning curve, and
Mhm.
you learn very quickly, or you get yourself wounded or killed. And it's the same for the young soldiers and Marines landing in a place like Vietnam at the beginning of that war. We all had a lot to learn,
Mhm.
Back. I'm sorry.
and some of us learned it fast, and some of us never learned it. And the results were 45 years ago. We folded our flag and left.
Right. But I have to ask, was there at any moment when you were fighting for those 2 years that you ever expected it to be what it was? Could you imagine that in your wildest dreams? And that 23-year-old Spitfire,
No, no,
wing it.
no. I thought the Marines have landed. I've got to get there quick because they're going to win this thing in a hurry. And I
You
had
missed your opportunity if you didn't get there, right?
I had to get there quick. And the first week I was there, uh, I learned very differently that this was not going to be over with quick. It was not going to be painless or easy, and we might as well hunker down for a very long, bloody struggle.
So
And
you knew that right away.
I learned that rather quickly. I got off the plane in Da Nang, and a fellow ran up to me. He said, "You are Monsieur Galloway?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, I am Henri Huet. I am UPI photographer. Come with me. There's a big battle." And I'm in chinos and loafers carrying a Samsonite suitcase. And I said, "What about my suitcase?" And he told me what I could do with it, and threw it into the 8th Aerial Transport Hooch and pulled me onto a C-130 plane, and we flew to a place called Quang Ngai City, which was surrounded by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. And we got off that plane, and he ran over to a Marine helicopter and chatted with the crew chief, and he waved at me, and we jumped on that chopper, and off we fly. I don't know where to. And we fly out about 15 minutes into a broad rice paddy with a big hill in the middle of it. And I can see a lot of people dotted on the top of that hill. And we land there, and we get out, and there's dead silence on that hill. There is a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers who have been wiped out to the last man. And the reason we're there is to pick up the bodies of the 2 American officer advisors to that battalion. And we went, they dug little shallow fighting holes, and all of these Vietnamese are laying there like they're holding their rifles, but the rifles are gone and they're dead. And we went hole to hole until we found those 2 Americans. And the crew chief let us come because he needed help carrying the bodies back to the helicopter. And we flew back to Quang Ngai City, and I'm looking into the faces of 2 dead young American officers. And, nothing looks like John Wayne in that picture. That was my introduction to Vietnam.
Wow.
Hey, Joe.
That's a hello, here we go kind of moment. Woo!
My battery quit. You and I have known each other for a long time as former colleagues at UPI, and I've done a half dozen interviews with you. We've talked a lot, and I've always been struck by your anger at the way your soldiers, were treated when they came home, the way the U.S. citizens had come to hate them. I'd like to share your thoughts about that, because it seems like it's always in your mind.
It is always there. There were nearly 3 million young Americans who served in Vietnam over the 10 years of that war. And they went over one by one. They came home one by one if they were lucky. And they came home to no welcome, no ceremony, no respect. And whatever you thought about the war, and I thought it was a great mistake, but I could never say that around the soldiers that I marched with and lived with. I had more respect for them than that. And you can't tell a soldier that his buddy has just been killed for no good reason, or that dozens of his buddies had just been killed for no good reason. I think that America has finally awakened to the sacrifice and service of those who wear the uniform in later wars. But Vietnam, they really got it wrong. They hated the war. They hated the politicians who started the war, and they extended their hatred to the soldiers who were drafted and ordered to go fight that war under our flag. And most of them, I think, have forgiven the country for that, but I haven't. I'm still bitter on their behalf. I'm still angry on their behalf.
One of the most compelling things I heard you say was that people came to hate the war, and so they hated the soldiers who fought it, who were their children.
Exactly. And I what I have to say is this. They may not have been the greatest generation, but by God, those who served in Vietnam were the greatest of their generation.
Yeah.
And I salute them for that service. I stood beside them and I fought beside them. Even as a civilian, I carried a rifle and I used it when I had to. They're my brothers in arms.
Yeah.
I owe them my life.
Mm.
Hey, one of the interesting things is I asked you about the two Medal of Honor winners, the helicopter pilots. You said there were three, and other people, you don't talk about it, but you actually won a Bronze Star yourself for rescuing one of the soldiers. So that didn't make you like a reporter. It was more like an involvee in the battle.
One never wins a Medal of Valor. One earns it, and especially a Medal of Honor. I was in a 3-night, 3-day battle in November of 1965 where 3 individuals earned the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration that our country gives. And that's rare. That tells you a lot about how intense that battle was. And in fact, it was the first clash between the North Vietnamese regulars and the American Army regulars. And it turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the entire 10-year war. 305 Americans were killed, 250 wounded. There were infantry companies that started one day with 110 men, and at the end of that day had 8 men left who could get on the truck to go home. The dying and suffering were everywhere around me. The bodies wrapped in their ponchos were all over the place. You know, I left that place totally changed, totally feeling an obligation to tell the truth about those soldiers and all soldiers for as long as I live.
You know,
and I have tried to do that.
yeah. And before we go on, I have to go back and just say, you have such a unique perspective because here you are, a civilian. You're doing your job over there, which is a total different job than those soldiers, but it's kind of intermingled. You can't be there and not have, like you said, pick up a weapon and do what you need to do. But you didn't go home cry. You didn't say, take me out of here, especially after your first experience of, landing, getting on a helicopter and going. That is a huge service to our country and our soldiers. That says so much about you as a man. You said, no, I have an obligation to share and report and do what my job is. And there's not a lot of people out there.
What I would tell you about this is you cannot sit in the middle of hand-to-hand combat and be a neutral observer, because on the other side, they're trying their best to kill you and to kill everyone around you. And I don't know about other journalists, but I know that I had an M16 on my shoulder when I landed there and a lot of ammo. And I grew up in Texas. When people shoot at me, it really pisses me off. And I'm liable to shoot back.
Yeah. Well, maybe see another reason why I love Texas. Another great man came out of Texas. So this is why I like you. No, that's not the only reason why I like you. There are many more. It's not just because you're from Texas. But we got to move forward here. I can listen to you all day, but I want to hear about this book. I hear through the grapevine there is a book out there that can you tell me about? What is the making of this book? Who's involved? How do you go now?
This book is coming out May 12th. The title is They Were Soldiers: The Sacrifices and Contributions of Our Vietnam Veterans. And it's long overdue. What we do here in this book is we do interviews and profiles of 49 Vietnam veterans, guys from General Colin Powell to Fred Smith of FedEx to Diane Carlson Evans, the Army nurse, people you never heard of. And what we do is we focus less on the war they fought and more on the lives they have lived and the good they have done for their communities and our country since their war. And I defy anybody to read this book with completely dry-eyed, because there are stories in there that just bring tears to your eyes. This generation of veterans came home, as we said, to no welcome and no respect, hunkered down, built good lives, tried their best to do good for the country, for their fellow veterans, and for their communities. And it's a story that hadn't been told and needed to be told. And so my co-author and I decided we were going to tell it.
So I have to ask you a question. You've referred often to the fact the Battle of Hai Drang was the battle that made Ho Chi Minh know he could win. And yet it was the battle that Johnson's people learned we couldn't win, and yet another 10 years passed before it ended. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. At the end of that bloody fight, the commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division sent a message to Saigon asking permission to pursue the defeated North Vietnamese into Laos across an imaginary line on a map. All jungle on both sides, who cares? And they wouldn't hear of it. It was bumped up from Saigon to Washington to the Pentagon and then to the White House. And the message came back from Lyndon Johnson himself: don't you dare cross that line. And at that moment, General Vo Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese commander, knew that we had ceded strategic command of the battlefield to him. He would decide where and when we fought and when it ended, and he would always do it within reach of that international border with Laos or Cambodia. And his people could cross that line and refit and reinforce and rearm in safety. And that's not the way to fight a war, or it's a way to fight a war that you're not going to win.
But you were among those who, in reading Robert McNamara's information after he retired,
that's
he
the backside of that story. Is that Lyndon Johnson was so shocked by the number of American dead in 1 week, which was more than which was more than had occurred in the entire war up to that point. And McNamara was off in Europe visiting NATO, and Johnson ordered him to go immediately to Vietnam and find out what the hell is happening over there. And he did. He talked to everybody, got on his plane going back to Washington, and in a memo, top secret, eyes only to Johnson, dated 30 November 1965, he said these words: "We have exceeded the escalation by the North Vietnamese, but they have met it. They have met our escalation, and we can give Westmoreland the 200,000 more troops he's asking for, but what that means is by early 1967, we'll have 500,000 Americans on the ground in Vietnam, and all we can possibly achieve is a stalemate at a much higher level of violence." And on the 15th of December, Johnson called a meeting of the wise men in Washington, D.C., and he walked in and he was holding McNamara's memo in his hands, and he shook it at McNamara and he says, "Bob, do you mean to tell me no matter what I do, I can't win in Vietnam?" And McNamara said, "Yes, sir, that's right." And they sat down and they discussed it, and then unanimously voted in favor of giving Westmoreland 200,000 more American troops and continuing a war they knew they could not win.
And I remember you talking about in 4 days of discussion, not 1 second was spent on the possibility of ending it then.
No, and I've said before, I wish that I could have written a story so powerful that it would have driven us out of that war, because then there would only be 1,100 names on that wall in Washington, D.C., not the 58,400 names that are carved there today.
Oh, the power of the pen, the power of the pen. Well, you're doing your duty now. Man, you can't go back. Right?
Wish I could have done it then. I would love to have them carve on my tombstone, "He stopped a war."
Yeah, but there's going to be something even more brilliant because of where you are now and what you're doing, moving forward with your book and giving the voice. And I think actually that you are now part of a whole change in mindset of the Vietnam War, of, things that those people in those stories or other Vietnam veterans that are going to read it are going to be able to release, and they are going to have a common bond, and it's going to give them something greater than where they were before this book was done. So I see some massive power. No, it might not be the power of the pen that you were thinking of, but I think you are doing something just as equally as important now. You're changing it. But so who's this? You have a special relationship with General Norman Schwartz. I can't say it. I said it in my brain so many times. Schwarzkopf. Woo! Do you have a friendship, a relationship with that person?
I did. I first met him in Vietnam in the summer of 1965 when he was a brand new Army major and an advisor to a battalion of South Vietnamese paratroopers. And later he rose to 4 stars, and he was the commander-in-chief of the Persian Gulf War. And The Army, the professional officer corps in the U.S. Army is a lot smaller and more tightly connected than anyone would believe. My co-author, General Hal Moore, as a young major, was the tactical officer at West Point, the infantry tactical officer who persuaded Schwarzkopf he should go airborne infantry and not off to some pencil pushing job which his father had recommended. And so there are these strings that reach out across the years. And I land in Saudi Arabia on the eve of the Gulf War. And the press guys in the Army are stiff arming the media. There's 1,200 reporters all over the place, and none of them are getting close to the story. And I put in a dozen requests to do things, and none of them were going anywhere. And one morning, we'd been up all night with rocket attacks, and I finally laid down to get a little sleep, and my phone started ringing, and it was a different public affairs officer on the phone with one of my requests saying, well, sir, we're working on this and we're going to get this done. And they kept ringing, and I said, something funny is going on here. And the last phone call was from the Navy captain, who was the chief public affairs guy. And he says, how come you didn't tell me you know General Schwarzkopf? And I said, look here, Captain, I know a lot of generals and I don't usually talk about it. He said, well, he wants to see you in his office at 11 a.m. I'll escort you over. And he did. And as soon as I got in that office, Schwarzkopf threw the Navy captain and everybody else out of the office, closed the door, turned around, and took the cover off of his battle map and showed me what he was going to do and what he was not going to do when the invasion launched in 2 weeks' time. And we talked about this campaign for half an hour, and then we talked about Vietnam for a couple of hours. And he says, Joe, he says, you got any suggestions for me? And I said, well, sir, you've got 300 or 400 reporters in that hotel across the street from this headquarters, and they have nothing to do. And I must tell you, they are the most militarily illiterate bunch of fools I have ever seen. And they're a greater danger to you than the entire Iraqi army across the border. He said, well, where is that my problem? And I said, well, it's your problem because they're going to be writing all the stories about your war. And if I were you, I would start War 101 briefing every morning and brief them on the M1 Abrams tank and the artillery and all of that stuff. And he said, I can do that. And we talked a little more, and he told me that the Marines were pushing him to approve an amphibious combat assault onto the beaches of Kuwait against the Iraqi army. And he said, I'm never going to okay that. It would be a bloodbath. We're going to do this differently. We're going to come around behind them, not go straight into their guns. And so the next morning, they started War 101 briefings with the world's leading expert on the M1A1 Abrams tank, and the next day on the Firefinder counter battery radar detector. And the third day of briefings was the world's leading marine expert on amphibious combat landings. And he briefed at length on how you do it. Now, he never said, we're going to do it. He just said, this is how you do it. And the next morning, headlines across the world and network TV are all talking about the coming marine assault on Kuwait's beaches. And I'm sitting there biting my tongue through that briefing. I can't say a word. And it was what you call information warfare at its most skilled. They didn't lie. If they had lied, they would have been hanged from the yardarm. But they didn't lie. They just laid it out there, and like flies to a bowl of rice, here they came. Schwarzkopf, at the end of that session, he said, I know you want to go with the first Cav, but they're going to be in my reserve, and they may not get a whiff of this war because I think it's going to end very quickly. He said, I'm going to send you to the commander I have over here, who is most like General Hal Moore, and the division that has the most challenging and dangerous mission in my battle plan. And I said, Jesus, Norm, I thought we were friends. and he sent me down to the 24th Infantry Division mech and Major General Barry McCaffrey. And I had 10 days, 2 weeks before the invasion kicked off, to go through that division unit by unit, taking briefings, asking questions. I couldn't write a word until the invasion had launched, but I was writing my copy and stacking it up. And I had a public affairs major who was prepared. Once I disappeared over the berm with that division, would take all of my copy and put it on the fax to my headquarters back in DC. No pool. They had pools set up. They had censorship set up, but I was outside that circle. And that public affairs guy flew out every afternoon during the whole war to see if I had any copy or film that he could send for me. But you know, this is not what you call favoritism. This is what you earn over 30 years, 40 years of going to war. And starting off as a young man with the young lieutenants and captains. And if they live and you live, one day they will command armies, and you'll be a senior writer for somebody important, and they'll take your phone call. And they'll put you in the best spot to watch the whole war.
Man, you spoke truth. There's not only did you stand side by side, but you spoke truth, which is huge. Not your opinion. You were a fact finder and you articulated it.
Listen, you what I've tried to tell young journalists, if you're going on a military base, shoot straight, be honest, be upfront. Don't try to win a Pulitzer Prize your first trip in. What you must know is that the professional officer corps is very small. If you screw one of them, the word passes. It's like you've screwed them all. Yeah. And conversely, if you deal straight and honest and tell the truth, that word passes just as quickly, and the welcome you receive will be proportionate.
That is
Reporting 101.
Cool to have him here today.
so very cool. I want to go before I know we're a little over, but I want to talk because Mike told me this about when you go to the wall with all the names on it, and you spoke on it a little bit, but Mike, maybe you can ask the question a little better because you told me the story about
You know every name on that wall from the eye drying, don't you?
Yeah, I do. We were finishing the book, our first book. We were soldiers once and young. And we were going to print and did print in the front of that book the name of every man from the Iadrang Valley fight who died there and his hometown. And I needed to check that. There's an official roster of the names on the wall that you can buy a copy of at the Park Service bookstore at one end of the wall. And I stopped my car on my way into work and alongside that street, and I was on the wrong side to get to the Park Service book stand, so I had to walk the full length of the wall. And I came to panel 3 East, and I looked up, and there were the 305 names of every man who died in the Iadrang Valley in November of 1965. And I froze like a deer in the headlights. And I stood there. And by now, through the research, I knew every man's name. I knew a lot of them. I knew their families. I knew their dreams, what they hoped to do. And all I could do is stand there and weep. And I couldn't move for 45 minutes, just standing there and those names washing over me.
Yeah.
And after what you told me about the Iadrang Valley, I realized it should have been called the Valley of Valor.
Yeah. The North Vietnamese called it the Valley of the Screaming Souls, because their belief is that if you die and your body is not recovered, your ghost wanders that place forever in torture. And they had somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 of their men were killed there. And it was not until a good while after the war that they were able to go in there and recover the bones, and they built a national cemetery very close to that battlefield. We made trips back there, the general and I and some of our veterans, and they were always very careful to keep us away from that cemetery. They didn't want us to see how successful at killing them we had been.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that story, it just may have heard Mike say it and hearing it from your voice, it's very powerful. I think it speaks volumes of who you are and the experience of your life and your heart. So thank you for sharing that with us. And before we end, I would like to give you the opportunity to just give us, your points about your book, because now people know who you are. They know this is not just a book written to write. This has a purpose and a meaning, and you lived it and you are sharing it. So please honor us with 3 points, 2 points, 3 points, just about this book and what you want.
First, I'm going to tell you that if you have not read them, you should read them in sequence.
Okay.
We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which is the story of the combat in the Iadrang Valley, detailed like no other military history you have ever read. This book sold 1,300,000 copies in 7 languages. New York Times bestseller. We followed that up some years later with a book called We Are Soldiers Still, which was the story of the general and I traveling back to Vietnam, hooking up with the North Vietnamese commanders who had done their best to kill us, and going back to the battlefield with them and walking that blood-drenched ground, and ending up friends, not enemies, friends, blood brothers, you could say. What we found is that we had more in common with those North Vietnamese commanders than we have with your average American civilian. We and they had all shed blood, lost friends, fighting for our countries. They just as much as we. And you know, what we learned on the battlefield was that you better respect your enemy. If you don't, you're going to die a lot quicker in this war than you should.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes the last book in that trilogy, which is They Were Soldiers. And it's a fitting cap to the story. Not what we did in the war, but what we have done since the war, what we have done for our communities, for our country, by continuing our service unto this day. And I hope a lot of folks go out and buy the book, because the stories are worth it.
Yes, I'm going to put the link in there of how to buy the book to make it easy, because people want easy. We get complacent.
Amazon.com will sell you all 3 of them.
And the book, because I know you have a copy somewhere. You showed it to me earlier. Can you hold it?
Wow,
See
delighted.
it? Over a little bit. There we go.
They Were Soldiers.
Yes, it's a very nice cut. There we go. That's perfect.
Yeah, you got it?
Yep, I got it. We got it.
All right.
And I want to tell you that we have some Army, we have some Marines. They're saying hoorah. We have an Army veteran that is just loving you and your message and can't wait to get the book. So you have really, I'm trying to find, I see my son who is a Marine vet. He's watching on Instagram. So you have a lot of people that you have touched today. So thank you so much, Joe, for being on and sharing a little bit of who you are.
Thank you. God bless you all.
Yes. And Mike, as always, thank you. And everyone out there, until next time, when the East and the West Coast collide, we will see you.
Nice to be here. See ya.
Take care. Bye-bye.